Hello everyone, my name is Neeraj and today we are going to see how Rails boots. Well, we already know how Rails boots. We execute this command and the server starts. Well, Rails does a lot of things behind the scene and today we are going to see some of them. So here I have a demo application and that demo application has a script directory and the script directory has a file called Rails. So when we start the server using Rails server, then this file gets executed. Notice that the very first thing this file does is it creates a constant app path, and that constant is a fully expanded path to our application. Then it requires the boot file, and then it requires Rails commands. So let's look at Rails commands. In the Rails commands file, the thing of our interest is this code, Rails server.new. Okay, so let's look at Rails server. Rails server is a subclass of Rack server, and it has a bunch of utility methods to handle various things. And one of the methods is set environment. However, before we go to set environment, let's look at default options. So these are the default options. If you define a port number, then that's great. If not, 3000 will be picked up. And now we know why 3000 is the default port for Rails server. Also, the same goes for environment. If a Rails env is passed as environment, then that environment will be picked up. Otherwise, it will be in development. So now we know what set method will do. It will do nothing else but set environment, Rails environment is equal to options environment, which by default will be development. Okay, so now Rails server.new has been done. Let's look at require app path. So require app path will invoke config application.rb. At the top of the application.rb, we have boot file. The next line is require Rails all. Well, that looks interesting. Let's take a look at that. Rails all is listing all the Rails components, and then it's requiring their rail type file. So what's a rail type file? Before we go to answer that question, let's see what is active record. Active record was originated to work with Rails initially, but since then it is not married to Rails anymore. And since active record is not married to Rails, we can use active record in another application using, say, Sinatra. However, Rails needs a few hooks, a few things to make active record work as per the likings of Rails. So what the core team decided is that all of these components will have a single file, and the name of that file is railtie, and that file will configure the gem as per Rails liking. So yes, active record, action controller, they are not directly married to Rails, but they contain one file which, if and when they get used with Rails, Rails can pass on the information, okay, how to go about configuring it. So now we know the reasoning behind having the railtie file. Let's look at what the railtie file looks like for active record. Before we go there, one more thing I want to discuss, and that is why are we doing all these things like railtie and all these things? The reason is because we want the server to start as soon as possible. Let's assume a scenario where in development environment, every single time I do Rails server, Rails goes on and wires and loads active record, action controller, action mailer, active resource, and test unit. Well, that will significantly increase the boot time. And that is not a good thing because it's quite possible that I'm not even using active resource, or maybe I'm not even using action mailer. So what Rails is trying to do here is trying through the rail tie not to load all the things at the very beginning. Rather, lazy load everything. Anyway, let's go and look at the rail tie file for active record. So this is a snippet of a rail tie file from active record. You can see that here the migration is being set to true and timestamps are being set to true on active record. Also, active record is saying that use the middleware query cache, and then it's saying use the middleware connection management. Also, there are rake tasks like database.rake, which lets you do something like rake db migrate, and then there is console loads active record base. The rail tie file also has a lot of initializers. Now, what is initializer? Well, the task of the initializer is to not to do anything right now, but to tell active support that if and when active record is loaded, then do these things. Once again, why initializers are doing what they're doing? They're doing what they're doing because they need those things when active record is loaded. And the whole concept is to make active record lazy. So here what's happening is that if we go line by line, then what active record is saying to active support is that, okay, under the active record key, hold on to these procs. When active record is loaded, then execute these procs. Here is another initializer with active record. This initializer is setting up the logger. Once again, when this code is executed, then the logger is not directly set up. What it's saying is that register an initializer called activerecord.logger under the key active record and take this proc. When I tell you that active record is loaded, then just execute all these procs. Here is another initializer, and this one does initialization of database. It reads the config database.yaml and then it establishes the connection. Here is another initializer which does the controller runtime. Here is another initializer which does something like reloadable connections, and it is invoked after action dispatch callbacks. Here is another initializer which takes care of instantiating the observers. Pay attention to the very first line here. It's a config.afterInitialize. So when we are doing the configuration phase itself has before initialization and after initialization. So in this case, active record is saying that after the initialization, execute these things. And in fact, it's not saying that execute these things. It's just saying that ask active support to hold on to these procs and to execute them when active record is loaded. So this was the rail tie file for active record. Now let's look at some of the rail tie entries in action controller. Here is the first initializer. It follows exactly the same pattern as active record, and this one is trying to set up logger. Notice that in this case, active support.onload, the key that is being passed is action controller. So basically the same thing is happening. It's saying that active support hold on to these procs under this key, and when action controller is actually loaded, then all these procs will get executed. Here is another initializer which sets up the cache store. This initializer sets the configs, for example, JavaScript directory, stylesheet directory, page cache directory. Okay, so we looked at the rail tie file for active record. We looked at the rail tie file for action controller. Similarly, the rail tie file will also be loaded for action mailer, active resource, and test unit. I'm not going to go through these rail tie file, but they follow exactly the same pattern as active record and action controller. So after the rails require all is done, Then the next line is bundler. So what bundler will do is that bundler will go through all the gems, and gems can also have initializers. I'm going to do a separate screencast where I will discuss how gems can have initializers. But at this point in time, just assume that you have a bunch of gems which have initializers, and those initializers will follow exactly the same pattern as shown by action controller railtie. So moving on, requiring the app path is done, and now we will start the server finally. So this is the start method, and it has a bunch of put-us statements which might seem familiar to some of you, because this is the method that is responsible for producing this output when we start our Rails server. Notice the last line of this method. It has a super. So what it does is that it passes on the control to rack, and rack looks for a file called config.ru. That's just is the convention for rack applications. When we create a new Rails application by doing Rails new demo, then by default we get this config.ru, which has these two lines. It requires the environment file, and then it runs the application. So let's look at environment.rb. This is the environment.rb, and it has two lines. The first line is requiring the application, which we just saw, and then it initializes that application. So let's look at initialize method. The initialize method is pretty simple. It executes run initializers. Okay, so here is initializers, and initializer is collecting all the initializers, sorting them properly, and then executing each one of them. Well, that makes sense. Now let's look at all the initializers. Well, the initializers are nothing else but the collection of initializers from bootstrap initializers. So Rails itself has a bunch of initializers which is run before any other initializer. Then all the initializers which have been collected from active record, action controller, action mailer, active resource, and from gems. And also the initializers from our own application, from a demo application, because demo application has a few initializers under demo config initializers. And then Rails has a bunch of finisher initializers. So all these initializers are executed. So let's look at a list of some of the bootstrap initializers plus initializers loaded through railtie. So here we have a bunch of initializers. We already looked at some of them. For example, ActiveRecord.logger and ActiveRecord.log runtime. Here are some more initializers. Some are from action controller, some are from action mailer. There is add routing path, which suggests that it adds something to the routing, add view paths. And here are some more which are related to I18N, active support, and action view. So after all those initializers have been executed, then Rails will execute the initializers which are defined in my demo application. And by default, these are the initializers: backtrace silencer, session store. And if we have defined our own initializers, then those initializers will also get executed. And lastly, Rails will execute finisher initializers. In the finisher initializer, we have add to prepare block, eager load, and disable dependency. So we saw a bunch of initializers. Now I'm going to go through a few of them. The very first initializer was load environment config. When we are starting the server in development mode, then config environment/development.rb file is loaded. And similarly, if we are starting the server in production mode, then config environment production.rb file is loaded, and that's because of this initializer. Also, we have a built-in route. This was a surprise to me. When I was researching this topic, I looked into this finisher.rb and I saw this initializer. Notice that the code is guarded against if block rails environment.development. So this thing will work only in development. So what is it doing? It's adding a file info routes.rb. So what that does is that just in development environment, you get this special route. In fact, if you're using Rails 3 application, then you can start your server in development mode and you can hit this route, localhost 3000/rails/info/properties. And it will give you, true to its name, all the information regarding your Rails application. The Ruby version that is being used, the rack version, the mailer version, all the middleware, the database adapter, and whatnot. So next we are building a middleware stack. The code for middleware stack was nothing else but something like app, and app is building a number of middlewares using the method default middleware stack. And if we look at default middleware stack, it has a list of all the middlewares, starting from action dispatch static to rack lock, rack runtime, rack send file, flash, method override, head, and whatnot. Okay, so this is the one which has to do with loading the changes in the routes file. So the name of the initializer is set routes reloader, and notice that code, the method dot execute if updated. So execute if updated. So this routes reloader should get executed only if it has changed. So initially I was under the impression that when I hit a refresh on my browser in development mode, then all the constants, all the classes are reloaded. I thought that that routing file is also reloaded, but that is not true. The routing file will be reloaded only if it has changed. Otherwise, between one refresh and another refresh in development mode, the routing file will not be loaded. And that's a good thing because it cuts down on the processing, and that makes the request go that much faster. This is regarding disable dependency loading during the request cycle, but this will happen only if the cache clashes is true, which happens in production environment. Also, there is eager loading, and eager loading will happen only if cache classes is true, which happens in production environment. So in production environment, we run active support before eager load, and then we eager load things. So now at this point in time, you might be wondering, what is eager load? So this is the paths method inside engine configuration, and notice that paths.add app controllers, app helpers, app models, and mailers, they have eager load true. But notice that view does not have eager load true. So what does that mean? What it means is that, let's say you have a model and that model has a typo. Now because of that typo, it has a somewhere typo at the very top, so that instead of class, C is missing, it has just las. If you try to start your server in production mode, then you will get an error. The server will not start. The reason why server will not start, because it will try to load all the models inside app models, and it will run into that syntax error. So that's what eager loading means, that in production environment, it will try to load all the entities under that controller. And since app views does not have eager load true. So what it means is that, let's say you have your index.html.erb. There you can go and you can make some kind of typo, you can make all kinds of syntax mistake. And if you start your server in production environment, then server will start without any trouble. The reason why server will start because the views are not being loaded at that time. For views, the eager load is not true. So views are resolved in production environment only when they are hit the very first time. Okay, moving on, we have an initializer initialize dependency mechanism. So this basically tells that when we are loading a class, whether we should use require or load. In production, it will use require. In development, it will use load. We also have an initializer called add to prepare block. What it does is that it passes a block to call back to prepare, and because of that, what happens is that it gives us the ability to pass anything, a block to config.toPrepare, and that will be invoked before every single request in development environment. In production environment, it will be executed only once. This is a little bit more complicated topic, and most likely I'll have a screencast on this sometime later. And lastly, we have set clear dependencies hook. So what happens is that after a request has already been served, then at the end, Rails goes ahead and unloads all the constants which have been auto-loaded. So again, it will not unload all the constants. It will only unload the constants which have been auto-loaded. Okay, so you will say server has already started. Now what about the onload hooks that I talked about earlier? Well, the thing about the onload hook is that when active record base is loaded, then at the end of the active record base, we see a line like this. So basically active record base at that point is saying that, okay, active record base has already been loaded. So now go ahead and I will ask active support to fire all the initializers and all the procs which have been held in the bucket against the key active record. So basically all the onload initializer onload that was being stored in active support, that will get fired when active record base gets loaded. So now the question is, when is active record base gets loaded? Well, thanks to auto-loading, during the initialization process, Rails never asks that to load active record. If and when active record is loaded, then all those procs will get fired. I noticed that one of the initializers in demo with the name wrap parameters has this line of code: if defined active record. So if defined active record is constant, so at this point of time active record gets loaded, and when active record base gets loaded, then all those procs get fired. If you comment out these three lines, then when you start your server in development mode, then server would have started without having loaded active record. And when you go and hit localhost 3000/users, at that time active record will be loaded on runtime. Well, this code was tested with Rails 3.1, RC1, and RE 187. I hope that this screencast tells you, or at least teaches you a thing or two about how Rails boots. If you have any feedback, please send it to me, and thank you.